and the finance committee. So typically a finance committee is looking more at the operating budget and just the cash needed to meet expenses and the revenue that comes in, where the trustees are usually managing longer term assets, maybe stocks and bonds that people have given, or part of their estate planning that they will give money to an organization. So it's a little bit different. It's not as short term. Typically what the trustees are responsible for, it's more kind of a long term, and the long term viability of an organization from a financial perspective. So I think a trustee needs to take seriously that sacred duty, because usually the money that's in where the trustees manage, it's been given, donated from people in the meeting, from people that believe in the cause. And so they give that money believing that this organization can do something with this in a long-term way. So that's another perspective I look at. I think trustees are responsible to increase the value of a portfolio. When you think of the story that Jesus told about giving money to 3 different individuals, and one of the people just buried it in the ground and didn't use it for something. And the others did that to varying degrees. And the parable goes that the person that was giving the money did not give more to the one that buried it, because he didn't utilize that treasure for the good. So that's kind of where I view that we do have that responsibility, but we're also responsible for balancing risk versus reward. So, we when we talk about like a gambling, I don't think as trustees and stewards, we should be taking an inappropriate amount of risk. Because if you go higher risk, you could potentially have a higher reward, but you can also then the opposite can happen, and you can put the assets in jeopardy. So the trustees really do that balancing of risk versus reward. Also, trustees make decisions about what companies to invest in, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And then trustees balance this return on the investment versus the values of Quakers, because clearly the monies that trustees are responsible for is representative of our testimonies. What are we doing, and how are we living out those testimonies with what we do with money? So next slide, Della, please. So depending on the size of the money that a trustee is responsible for, and not just a trustee, but the trustees, is it good to use an outside firm to manage investments? My opinion is yes, even though it does cost some money, unless there is a huge amount of expertise among trustees, and usually there's not, as far as real sophistication in investments and stocks and bonds. I have found that it's good. It's money well invested to use a professional firm to do that, with, of course, guidance and policies from the trustees. At Western Yearly Meeting, we divide our investments between 2 firms. And we do that because one firm, they follow our guidelines as far as what companies we invest in and what kind of balanced portfolio we want. And they charge a higher fee for that because they make the decisions on specific stocks and bonds to purchase and fixed assets. The other company that we use is just, the trustees decide what stocks and bonds to buy, and they charge a fee to just execute that transaction. So we kind of did it to see, are the returns going to be similar? And they really have been. There hasn't been that much difference between the two. So, it kind of just depends, what kind of approach that you want to take on that. And then, of course, what kind of screens are going to be applied to the investment portfolio. So what are the things that we're going to tell the investment advisor, we do not want to invest in this. And that comes into play where whether the trustees make the decisions on the stocks and bonds, or an investment firm. And then there are companies like Friends Fiduciary, which is a Quaker investment firm. So it is the oversight, all the trustees, all of the board of directors on that are Quakers. And they do a lot of different things that I have found as far as how they do shareholder engagement. So we talk about that in another slide. But also, as Marilyn mentioned, Everence is another really good firm that, oh boy, where did those slides go? There we go. Everence is another really good firm that will do the same kind of thing. They are a Mennonite based firm. So next slide, Della, please. So we hear a lot about socially responsible investing. And, kind of what is it? It's really considering factors beyond just financial return. So again, looking at how does a company operate? That we're not just looking at a company's bottom line, but there's a phrase here, a triple bottom line. We look at the profits of companies, but we also look at how they treat their people and what they're doing to this planet. So, those are things that we want to consider. Actually, Quakers have been doing socially responsible investing dating back to the 1700s. So we do have a long history of that. Another term you're hearing a lot of these days is ESG investing, which means it's looking at environmental, social, and governance of these organizations. So again, it's not just looking at the bottom line and what kind of return, but what are these companies doing? So when we do that, I think we're taking kind of a more holistic approach in investments. So yes, we want to maximize our return, but we also want to balance that with value investing. Okay, Della. So the big question is, do we have, and several of you have brought this up in your wondering, do we have to give up return for Quaker values? And I think we've heard several folks share the answer is no. And actually, we can have those values and apply. These are some of the screens that we apply. A zero tolerance for companies that produce weapons or weapons components. Screen out companies which produce alcohol, tobacco, firearms, operate casinos, lotteries, and for-profit prisons. And many have been screening out coal since 2013. And some of you have been screening out fossil fuel. I'd be interested, for those that are trustees that are applying screens like these, are you screening out fossil fuel now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Yeah, I know at my monthly meeting, Indianapolis First Friends, we are now screening out fossil fuel companies. I will say it starts to get harder because some of these companies are they're conglomerates and they have so many divisions. So like take for an example, Microsoft. They have developed this night goggle vision that's going to be used in a military way. It's going to be used for the military specifically. And so then we're like, okay, does that mean that we don't invest in Microsoft? Which is a big decision because Microsoft has been a pretty blue chip company. But it does get more complicated as these companies get larger and larger. Okay, Della. So harvesting earnings from investments. A couple of you spoke that you use the dividends and have been able to use the dividends for some projects. A lot of times the trustees will decide, okay, we have this amount in our portfolio. Let's say we have $1 million. How much do we take out? And oftentimes it's a percentage. So how you actually get the money, you can do it by dividends, you might sell something, but you're looking at, if I take, typically it's 4 to 5% is what I've seen. If I take 4 to 5% of the total value of the portfolio, again, I am excluding, when I talk about that, I'm excluding property assets, which are a completely different thing because they don't produce cash. They can increase your value when you sell it. But these would be the portfolio, the investment portfolio. And again, 4 to 5% is usually what I've seen. At Western Yearly Meeting, we're actually taking 6.75%. At my monthly meeting, we're taking about 3.5%. Again, the lower the percentage, that's a more conservative approach. But you also don't want to be in a situation where you have all these assets and yet your operations are failing, or they're flailing. So over time, over history, and several of you, I would imagine, can confirm this, our portfolios have grown 9, 10, 12, 14% over a long period of time. So if we pull down 4%, the value of our portfolio is still going to increase over time, which is what you kind of really want to do that. Should we ever utilize the corpus of investments? Meaning, if a person donated $50,000, do you ever go into that principal? As opposed to working on or taking out the earnings, the growth of that. And I would say, whatever your baseline is of what you started with in the very beginning, you really don't ever want to touch that. That's, the intent of when people do give this is they're expecting it to be around for a long, long time. So that 50 years, 100 years from now, we're still thriving, but we're able to utilize that money to get a percentage that you can then add to your operating budget, or whatever you want to use it for. Like at First Friends, the 3.5% that we take, we do not use it for our operating budget. We use it for our building. So we've got a building from 1955. So all the things that we have to do with our property and our building, and even the personal property. So like our organ, piano, things like that, the 3.5% is utilized for that. Many organizations will utilize the how much you harvest to put right into the operating budget. At Western Yearly Meeting, that's kind of what we do. So it just depends. There's usually history involved in that. And sometimes there's policy on it, or anything like that. So that kind of depends on the organization and the meetings. And then you hear this term dedicated versus non-dedicated investments. So a dedicated investment means that the donor very specifically said, this is to be used only for this. So the legal responsibility is you must use it for that. It becomes difficult sometimes when the money was given a long time ago for a purpose, and that purpose is not still relevant or active. And you really actually have to go to the court system and get approval to use that dedicated money for something else. It doesn't happen hardly ever, because a lot of folks will give non-dedicated investments. So they don't say you must use it for the cemetery. Now, what sometimes happens is the trustees or the meeting or the organization makes a decision, or the yearly meeting. Well, we want to use this for X or Y. It's not, that can be changed. So it is dedicated, but it's dedicated, or we call it, it's designated funds. So it's not dedicated, but it's designated. And that's a big difference then, because that's not a restriction that the donor put on, that's a legal obligation. It is the governing board has made that decision, and that decision can change too. And then the question is, how do you report all this information to stakeholders? I have found, and I would love to hear, I'm going to stop after this too. I'd love to hear what some of your all experience has been. Sometimes there's been a hesitation to be completely transparent about the money that the trust, the investments, and just the whole portfolio, the money that the trustees are responsible for. I have found that at my monthly meeting, and I think part of it is we have a significant amount in our we call it an endowment. It's, with what the trustees manage here, but because they feel like our members of our meeting, members and attenders, they won't give to our operating budget if they know we're holding, all this money over here. So I have found there is some hesitation in that. And I would love to hear from all of you if you've experienced that at all. Like, how do you report the information? I mean, we want to be transparent, but sometimes folks don't really understand the limitations and kind of the requirements of that money, or that portfolio. So what's the experience you've all had? Oh, okay. Edward.
We've been, well, I gotta say, because I have to explain a little bit about our structure. We do have an outside firm that recommends investments to us, and we screen them according, basically, with everything that you've mentioned. Um, and our individual investors are not only the yearly meeting, which has its own account, but as I mentioned, several monthly meetings and other Quaker organizations. We harvest a rolling average of the last 3 years, percentage-wise, and send that to all our investors. They also have the option monthly to withdraw whatever they want. And right now, there's a big debate going on in the yearly meeting about taking out 40% of $1 million and just giving it to Native American tribes. And it's very controversial, and I'm against it because it seems foolish to me, but those are the kind of things I think you run into in organizations like ours, where some of the stakeholders want to just basically give all the money away, and others want to save it for the future generations of Quakers. So,
And Edward,
but that is
how did you get this money? Is it from donations of
we
individuals?
we actually, what we did was we sold an old folks home
Okay.
that we owned, and that also ties back to something you mentioned, which is that this home was essentially dedicated to retired women teachers. And that was not getting, I mean, what we discovered was there were no Quakers living in this home at all.
Yeah.
It was all local residents from the town where the home was. So we sold it to a hospice organization and invested the money. And we agreed that we would come back in 10 years. We did this happened 10 years ago. We'd come back in 10 years and the yearly meeting would review the situation and what we wanted to do with that money. And we're having the same debate we had 10 years ago about whether we give it away or we invest it.
Interesting. Alicia.
Hi, there were a couple of points that that I wanted to concur with when you talked about dividing the assets between allocating them to do two different places. We have Friends Fiduciary, and we are lucky enough to have somebody who is an investment advisor and has been in our meeting for 50 years and sits on, we have two sets of trustees for different reasons. One does all the property and the grounds, and the other one does basically all the donations that have come through the meeting or meeting excesses and things like that. And that's divided into, I don't know, 27 or 34 different allocations, designations, dedications. It depends. And they have names. But for the most part, then there's also a finance committee so we have these three separate entities. But anyway, the two sets of trustees both use Friends Fiduciary. And this one person who just, he leads one of the trustees, and they took a portion of the money and they invested it in ways that met the straight face test for Quakers. And they found that they basically got the same returns. So that was a really good exercise, just to make sure that, to see what Friends Fiduciary was doing and what they could do on their own. So just to speak to that point, and then for the most part, we take a 4% of a 3-year rolling average of our funds, and it does go to our operating costs. But our grounds and stuff are part of our operating costs, our building and all those things. So that seems to make sense for us. But yeah, but I find that our meeting as a whole, the meeting people are the stakeholders. A lot of them don't really have any idea of how this is managed, and we are fully transparent. Every year, each set of trustees talks about how much money is in the account and how much money is dedicated to this and what goes to that. So we're fully transparent. And then every once in a while, somebody gets a hairball that we should take all the money and do this with it or do that with it, when it really is tied up in ways that one cannot do that with it. And then they get really upset with one of the sets of trustees because they're really locked into what they're supposed to be doing and can't just give the meeting all the money. And so it causes a lot of friction. And I'm fine. And that's because we have a number of people. We do have a lot of people in the meeting. So there's a great misunderstanding no matter how much you explain it. I don't know how to overcome that. So if anybody has any good idea how to overcome that, I would really be happy to know. Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of the challenge that, when folks don't really understand, and they just think, well, look at you're holding all this money. I think what we've tried to do, not as maybe successful as we could, is anyone that's really interested in seeing all the details, they need to be available to anyone to see that. But we try to then really summarize at a high level. These are funds that can never be used for anything but this. And summarizing at high levels, and again, saying anyone that wants to see all the information, you're happy to, we're very happy to, but sometimes giving a lot of information will, when folks just don't have a comprehension of it, just because that's not been their background, it can sometimes cause more problems. So that resonates too. Susan.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to your question, but I think it's a really good one. one of the things that I didn't see reflected there that we found when I was a trustee was we have an old building. Now it's only 100 years old, but it was not built. It was built to house the Orthodox Baltimore Yearly Meeting. So it's a gigundo meeting room. It seats like 275, and we have an average weekly meeting of maybe 50, and then other spaces. But it has to do with investment in the building. We retrofitted for an elevator, and it had lived its lifetime pretty well and needed to be replaced. We put solar panels on the roof and wanted to expand the solar panels. We had to put a new furnace in quite a while ago. And one of the things the trustees grappled with, particularly with the elevator, because it turned out it was about twice as expensive as we had been led to believe, because for no reason, people didn't ask all the questions that needed to be asked because they didn't know the questions they needed to ask. There are times when you do have to dip into the principal, that you can't wait around to save up, in the sense that we take money into the operating. We use money from our harvest into the operating expenses, as well as having money that comes in through building rental and contributions. But we looked at what it would cost to borrow the money to do the job versus borrowing it from ourselves, which is kind of a paper pushing exercise as best I can figure it out, versus just taking the money and doing it. And so I do think that that's something that trustees are forced to think about, particularly when they have either old or large meeting houses.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I said that you really don't want to take from the corpus, but there obviously are certain times, depending on what your total amount that you have, you could have a big, large expense, a one-time thing that you might have to dip into that. Then I think when you do that, the goal is then how do we build that back up? But you're absolutely right. If you're going to have $100,000 furnace that you have to replace, that it's 4% of what you have just may not cover that. So let's see, Rashid.
Hi, my question was just for Susan, actually.
Okay.
Is this the Homewood meeting that you're discussing?
Yes.
It's such a wonderful building. Thank you.
And it's such a pain in the neck to maintain, but it is a fabulous, fabulous building. It is a fabulous building. Thank you.
Okay. Ron, you have a question?
There we go. Yeah, in a way, I think I have kind of an opposite issue from things that a lot of other people are saying. I'm the trustee of my meeting in Flushing, Queens. And our board has kind of a scarcity mindset and sort of issues with the concept of servant leadership, let's say. So they have become sort of like dead set on the idea of selling our air rights to real estate developers, despite the fact that pretty much like the whole rest of the meeting that is not on the board of trustees, and it's a small meeting of about a dozen members at this point, is opposed to this idea. And it has really sort of like stalemated the meeting in a lot of difficult ways. And also they are so dead set on acquiring like $5-6 million for not doing anything other than just, oh, you want the rights to our air, Mr. Real Estate Developer? Here, give us money. That they've really kind of neglected any other sorts of paths towards financial viability, particularly ones that are faithful to Quaker values. And it's been a real challenge to figure out how to work within that kind of system.
Interesting. So first off, selling air rights, I'm not familiar with that. Is that a New York thing?
I guess it is. So quick explanation. Long story short, everybody has in New York real estate, you have the rights to build a building so high, like let's say 7 stories high. And our building is 2 stories high. We could essentially sell the rights to build an additional 5 stories to our next door neighbor, who could then build a 12-story building.
Wow. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's basically a New York City thing.
I think so.
And
Yeah.
it is kind of how Midtown Manhattan got to be as full of skyscrapers as it is.
Wow. Yeah, you know, I see it in organizations. As a pastor, I see it among families. Things can get really ugly when it comes to money. It really can. And it can divide people. You know, and that's just kind of where we have to keep coming back to the spiritual side of this. Like, how are we, how is what we're doing allowing the Spirit to live out? And how are we treating each other? So yeah, those can become very difficult. I've seen it so many times. Any other comment?
I see Marilyn has a question.
Yes, Marilyn.
First off, I can't find the hand.
Okay. We'll do a one-on-one to find you the hand, Marilyn. Okay.
Okay. Information. We provide a report every month within the financial report as to the principal of the brokerage account and what is undedicated, what is not designated. These are the growth that has resulted in the account. And it is from that growth then that we feel that we can sometimes take funds to cover things. See, did I have something else? The one thing I mentioned earlier is we are all stock. We are not with funds. We are all stock. And so when the stock vote comes out, I can't say who any of the directors are, but every time on the bottom, if it says, do you want us to do a report on how much we donate to campaigns? I say yes, even though that says, no, we don't want you. I say yes. And every time it asks how we're treating our employees or what percentage, I say yes, because I think that's hidden. And I don't think it should be. So we vote our conscience in our proxies. But that's just, I can't say that anything else they do. I recognize the companies that audit them, but those are the things that I think as a Quaker, we should really say something.
So Marilyn, let me ask you a question. I'm curious.
Now, if I saw something in the news.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You cut off, I didn't hear your question.
Okay. What I'm curious, why was the decision made to make all your investments in stocks?
My discussion with Edwards, because we went through a whole lot of mutual funds trying to weed out companies that had bad things. And then I went through a whole lot of mutual funds that were very, very green. And we decided to go, the dividends on the green companies are like nothing. You commented about Microsoft earlier. We would never buy Microsoft because it doesn't pay dividends. So
you're kind of dividend driven when you look at, and that's a real important aspect.
We're driven by growth in income is our goal.
Okay.
And we are very aggressive.
I would agree. I would agree.
And we go through the brokerage's recommendations, and I bring that to the financial people because in our group, finances runs this. And I say, here are the best choices. And then,
Well, yeah, I mean, for your circumstances, it's kind of worked for you. I would say, usually in general, you're looking at more of a balanced portfolio. So when
we are.
you have 70% in stocks and 30% in bonds,
Okay.
not mutual funds, but because the stock market's volatile. I mean,
I'm very much aware.
It's really high right now, and it's going to go down at some point. This is
I
the way
agree.
it is. And bonds are more stable. You're getting a lower return. It's 5%,
Yes.
or whatever, but it's kind of guaranteed. So oftentimes, an organization or a meeting will do kind of maybe a 70-30 or 60-40. Actually, I'd be interested in what other folks that are in this, do they do that? Do they look at a balanced portfolio with a percentage of stocks and bonds? Because you're saying, Marilyn, you're 100% stocks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now the stocks are balanced between the different categories, but yes.
You mean different industries?
Yes.
Okay.
We probably hold 12 or 15 companies.
Okay. So Jim, do you have a balanced portfolio?
Yeah. This is Jim Riley. I am a trustee of my local meeting, but I'm also treasurer and a trustee of our yearly meeting. And we have investments in both places. And but I wanted to make a comment about this question about utilizing the corpus of the investment. I think it's important to understand the difference between the various types of restrictions that a donor can put on a donation. And I'm also a CPA, so I see the accounting part of this, but I don't want to get off on that. But you do have with a not-for-profit or a tax-exempt organization, you have what's called fund accounting. So you have one fund that is unrestricted, and you can do whatever you want with it. That's the money that just comes in as regular donations, and you're paying the gas bill and whatever. But you can get donations that are restricted in different ways. Our meeting received a bequest, and the term of the bequest was you can invest this amount and use the income from the investment, but you can't touch the corpus. And that's what's called a permanently restricted fund. It's like an endowment. So trustees have an obligation to protect the wishes of the donor. But you might also receive donations that say, the donor says, I want this donation to be used for the maintenance of the burial ground, but you can use it however you want. You don't have to protect the corpus. You can spend it down if you need it. And that's what's called a temporarily restricted fund. So you can just spend it down and use it all if you need it. And then the third kind of restriction is what's called a designated fund. And that's when the meeting or the organization itself says, we're going to just take this chunk of money and designate it for building use or whatever. So it's taking basically unrestricted money and designating it for a certain use. And that's not a restriction that the donor puts on, but that's a restriction that the trustees would probably put on. Anyway.
Yeah. No, those are really good points.
I think those are some important distinctions to remember.
Definitely. You're absolutely right. I mean, the key is when the donor puts a restriction on it, that's a legal obligation. And you have to follow that. So, yeah. Edward.
I just wanted to answer your question.
Yeah.
In New England, one of our policies is 60-40, and that is hard when the stock market is going up so fast because the percentages change very quickly, and then you have to decide to try and put things back in balance, and which is what we do.
Yeah, when the stock market goes up, you're rebalancing it. You know, we rebalance about at the yearly meeting, you know, every 3 months we meet and kind of really with our investment advisors and talk about it, because then you have to start selling things to get you back into the balance of the guidelines. So, okay, hey Della, let's go on to my next slide.
Okay.
So this is a concept that, again, has become more prevalent, and for some trustees more important, is shareholder engagement. So, you know, one question, if you have an investment manager, do they engage in this? Which means that they are, because they own shares, they are advocating for certain positions or certain policies of that company that they have concerns about to change. So as an example, at Friends Fiduciary, they have a couple of staff dedicated to doing this. So they are looking at what the organizations are doing and are there things that we're wanting to influence a change in behavior. And one of the companies was Kroger. And it was based on their, they were utilizing a certain kind of a cooling system on all their coolers that was not good for the environment. So we worked with the company and they've actually changed the policy in what they're doing. So in that way, it is using the investments that we have and the principles and values and testimonies of Quakers to try to get companies to change behaviors. So, and you kind of do it from an inside perspective because you are a shareholder. Other things are DEI issues with the company. DEI is diversity, equity initiatives, and how are they doing that within their companies? The environmental issues, like I was just describing with a Kroger, the social focus of the company, and then what's their governance focus? How do they govern themselves? So when you engage and I think personally, it'd be hard if you're not using a firm to really be able to do that. I mean, maybe there are folks in an organization or a meeting or yearly meeting that really have this expertise and the time to do it, because this is a real investment to engage in a shareholder way. Next slide. So the tensions of returns and values. I mean, we know doing what's right isn't easy always. But again, as we live out our testimonies, we feel like it's important. And I think what I've experienced and what I'm hearing from many of you is you still are going to get a good return. You're not having to sacrifice in a significant way returns by being good stewards and investing appropriately with companies that are doing some of the right things. Diversification is important. You know, Marilyn was talking about different industries. I mean, some are, you know, do great. You wouldn't want to invest all your stocks in Amazon and Facebook because, you know, again, they've gone way up, but they can also come way down. You know, a lot of times when you look more at blue chip companies that have a really, really strong long-term track record, that seems to be more focused on value investing versus getting the best return tomorrow. And then, of course, you prioritize impact over return. So those are some of the tensions that we all, as trustees, have. Somebody was talking, it was Jim was talking about scarcity versus abundance and what's our mindset. And again, when it comes to money, sometimes we can just have a scarcity mentality. I'm afraid I won't have enough. So I'm going to hold on to it. And then on the other hand, you have I heard some stories of, well, we want to give all the money away. So it's kind of there's a balance there. But I've often found it seems like more that the scarcity mentality sometimes drives us. And I don't think that's what we're called to do, is just to have a completely scarcity kind of viewpoint. I'm sorry, Della, can you go to the next slide? That's where my scarcity versus abundance slide is. So these are the questions as trustees that we all have to ask ourselves. How do we think about money? I mean, it starts with our personal view, because we all bring that to whatever role we're fulfilling in our organizations that we're connected with. How do we think about our money? How do we treat our organization's money? Do we come from this place of abundance and generosity? And how do our investments ensure the future vitality of our organizations? So it is, yes, this money looks at the long term, but it's also what's the point in having a whole bunch of money and we're failing as an organization. So all those things are kind of all questions that as trustees we have to ask ourselves. So that's what I had today. Are there other, this has been such a great group, and again, so much experience. Are there other things that you'd like to bring forward?
My experience has been, I forget, somebody mentioned this earlier about the real difficulty of helping other people understand who are not spending their time as part of the trustees and for whom money is almost a foreign language, to put things in terms that they can understand and realize that no, the trustees are not being either profligate nor stingy. But being good stewards. And so if there are any words of wisdom that people have about other ways that they've helped friends understand, I would love to hear that.
Alicia. Oh, we can't, you're on mute.
I was going to ask if there's any training on how to bring some of these ideas to a greater population where money, just as the friend before me spoke, where it can be explained better, because our meeting has a lot of people, and we speak about abundance and they think that we are an abundant meeting, and yet we aren't meeting our yearly obligations on our operating costs. So we do take the money from some of the endowments, and we supply that, but we're not supposed to exactly be doing that, is my understanding, how we've set ourselves up. That should be more like medium and long-term projects. And I don't know, it's explained every year, and every year people choose not to understand, and I don't know how to have that conversation either. So Friends, that's two of us asking the same question.
So
Oh,
do you do a campaign? Because the way you can avoid that is if your individuals will contribute more, will come from a place of abundance.
the finance committee basically, about 5 years ago just said, look, on average, we need this much money from each family. And a lot of people upped, we had, people making what they thought was a good donation, but nobody ever gave them a number. And once they said, oh, that's the number, they met that number. But they had no idea. They said, it's always give as you are able or give as you are led. And so people made their yearly donations year over year for many years, but it never went up. And yet the costs of the building and things go up. And then there are a few families who, when you throw out the Hail Mary at the end of the year and say, we need $40,000 or whatever that number happens to be, there are families who will make a large donation. And for the most part, the meeting has been covered. But there's a trend across, I don't know if it's across the world, but I spoke with somebody who understands about different yearly meetings, and they said that once upon a time Quakers used to own their own businesses and stuff like that. They just had more money available, and the population, our populations are decreasing, and those who are drawn to Quakerism aren't necessarily the industrialists and the businessmen that they once were. They're now just, people who work and everything, and money is a little bit tighter all the way around. So part of it is stewarding what we have and talking about abundance and scarcity. And it's a really hard conversation. I don't know how to have it. I mean, I have it. I don't know that I'm effective in the conversation.
I know what we've really tried to do is to hide, because people don't like to give money for the lights to be on and, pay the gas bill. But we can't do anything if we don't pay the gas bill and have the lights on. So it's, that it's a very necessary thing, but like telling the story of what the money, like what are the really good things that the money's being used for. So we've got a lot of young kids and families in our meeting. And so we tell the story about, we're gonna have a big vacation Bible school, and we do all these different things. That's how, and the money, yes, you keep the lights on, but it also allows us to do, all these various things, the money that we can give in our communities, the money we give to the food pantry. So, I mean, it seems like people are drawn to stories, and how can you take numbers and create a story, because there's more emotion to that. And then that's when people say, oh, I want to give to that. I want us to be able to keep doing that. I don't know. It's sometimes worked, and it's still, there's challenges on it too. Susan.
I chuckled when I heard somebody say that folks don't necessarily want to learn about the budget. About, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, we decided to display the budget differently when we presented it. And I think that how those numbers are displayed can make a big difference as to how people see it. So we have, there's the administrative costs, and then these are the changes from last year. But then there's a notes column, and it describes what that money is actually used for. And for every line item, you can see where does that money go. And I think at least people seem to understand that. And we do get questions. It's not like it's sort of not flying by. But I think that that's been really helpful. I don't know if Polly wants to speak to it. And if she doesn't, Polly has been leading a group over here. She and I go to the same meeting. She's been leading a group about putting together a narrative budget, which is the parallel or a companion piece to a regular budget. And that's been, it's been a very interesting process to do that. And we're, she can tell you more about it.
Polly.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Susan. So when you said telling the story, that's really what the narrative budget is going to do, is tell the story. And it is linked to the line item budget, because we still need the line item budget. But I think those of us who have been developing, this is the first time we've done this narrative budget. And those of us who have been developing it, I think that we're seeing that it's telling the story. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And what we've done is we've divided what we do up into 4 practices. And we will then be going through our line item budget and saying, how do these line items fit into those 4 practices, and coming up with like, okay, so we spend, 20% of our budget on learning and 32% of our budget on witness in the world. Those are 2 of the practices, for example. So that's been a really great thing. We got a draft and we're bringing it to the meeting for the second time in June, and we'll see what kind of feedback we get, because we just sort of presented it the last month. So anyway, I think that's going to be a helpful thing. And then the meeting as a whole, I think, will be more focused on the narrative budget, and the line item budget will be, are we, doing what we said we were going to do?
Yeah, that's great.
So,
yeah.
I've had a little experience, not so much with narrative budget, but with narrative reporting, because people weren't quite ready for the narrative budget. So we started that, and it got some pretty good reception, but it took a bit of work. So I will love to hear from Polly and was it Darlene about how that goes. And maybe that's something that we do in our next series. So we have like 4 minutes left. So
I just want to say one thing. It has taken some work to put the narrative budget together, and we're not positive what kind of reception we're going to get. So, and we did gather information from people. We invited everybody in the meeting to come to dinners to talk about stuff and all this. And so it isn't just that the trustees have come up with this.
That's good. That level of investment from other folks, I think.
Yeah, it has been good.
Kay?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that one of the things that I'm bringing to the board that I'm on to consider kind of mirrors the whole idea of a narrative, but we're going to be using something called a logic model to help us identify our practices that we do that link to the money that we are going to be spending, just in a little bit different way to package it. But from my perspective, it seems like the logic model appeals a little bit more to those people who are very financially focused and don't always think about the story. So it meets both perspectives. So just something to think about.
Darlene?
Well, it wasn't me, but we have developed, thanks to my co-clerk, 3 different ways that we present the finances. The one is just the numbers and the recognized balance sheets and whatnot. But then we've developed flow charts that show clouds and arrows and dots of where things are going, where the money comes from, those kind of things. And then for those that are more, like the narrative kind, we've developed a sort of a narrative kind of presentation. So we use all 3 of those so that people that relate to numbers and money can get to it. So we found that to be very helpful.
Thank you all. Thank you, Beth. I am putting in the chat a survey form, whether you've come just to this one or all of the sessions or 2 or 3. Please make sure to fill that out. We will be sending it out by email as well. I am really sorry that neither Emily Province or Katrina McConaughey, our administrative assistant, were able to be here today, and you got stuck with Della, who was in the midst of some transition, needing to be with a friend who had been in a pretty serious car accident. And so I apologize that that was a little, you know, it was a little wobbly beginning, but thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Beth. I wondered if we might just take a few seconds to close in some silence before we dismiss. Darlene, did you have something to say?
Yes, could we get contact information from you, Beth, so that we can
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beth, if you would
You
put
want me
that
to
in
type it in
the
the
chat.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Let's enter into just a few moments of silence to bring this to a close. Thank you, friends. May you go forth and be good stewards.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Will we have contact information for each other?
We're going to send that out in another email. We'll send the survey out in one email and then a request for those who would like to be on a contact sheet, and particularly about what expertise we have to offer. And we're still looking at the possibility of putting together either a Facebook or Google group, or possibly both, to continue the conversation, as well as thinking about doing a second series in the fall.
Thank you.
That's
You're
great.
welcome.
I found this very beneficial and really good information for where our meeting is. We only have our meeting house, but to hear about cemeteries and offices and all this. So we're really struggling between calling our building users rent or donations. And so I'm looking for expertise that can help us sort that out in terms of being a nonprofit religious organization. How do we call those, and how do we deal with having renters, if that's what it is?
Are these, like, what kind of renters are they?
Building use people. They're like other groups, like the Sufis come and use our meeting space, or a meditation group will come and meet, and sometimes teachers from across the street want to quiet the place, or need parking in use our parking lot during the week. Do we call that rent? Do we set up rent? Who in the heck is the landlord? We have clerks that are financial people, and they change often. And how do we keep that registration up with the state? And if we have clerks that change every 2 years or every year, we're all alternating, then who's the landlord? And how do you deal with landlord-tenant laws and regulations? So it's like, and is it a percentage? Can you have a percentage that's rent as opposed to donations? So
I would just say that from a not-for-profit perspective, you can charge rent. I mean, we charge rent in our building. Some outside group wants to, the Daylily Society comes in here every month. And we charge them. We decide, the landlord is the meeting. So it's the meeting. It's not a person. But then you have to have the coordination, and it is an issue when the clerks keep changing, because, like, if your finance clerk changes, you got to change it at the bank, right? I mean, we have to go in there every 2 years to change the person on the bank. So it's, someone's got to.
We have a treasurer, so that's continuing, but.
Oh, okay. But yeah, you can charge rent. I mean, the organization might want to just make it a donation because that's maybe better on their end. But it is absolutely legal to charge rent. We have a preschool co-op here, and we charge them a monthly rental fee, which is a really, really good deal. But the amount that you charge, you know, you look at the going rates and what, you know, what is appropriate. So would you agree, Della?
Absolutely. Yes.
Is there a percentage of